Welcome to the next in our podcast series, Your Places or Mine, with me, John Goodall, the architectural editor of Country Life.
And me, Clive Asset, a visiting professor at Cambridge.
This podcast attempts to look at particular places and things that Clive and I visit on our travels around the country, and it tries to capture some of the conversations that we have after having had these visits, which we hope will be of interest to more than just ourselves.
We hope. And this podcast is going to be slightly different because it's on a whole theme. It's on a whole lot of people, isn't it, John?
Yes, a theme that I suddenly discovered that Clive happens just to have written a book about some time ago, which I didn't even know existed.
No, John, I can't bear it.
No, well, tell me.
Born to blush unseen.
And it's the subject of Americans and country houses, but with two particular twists. We thought that we would talk in the first half about American heiresses, this late Victorian phenomenon of American heiresses coming to England and supporting the tottering country houses of England, and then in the second half about Americans who became Anglophiles and men, exactly, who were businessmen and so forth, who invested huge sums of money also in country houses.
Yes,
both of them
also striking.
And we're also very striking. It's a sort of very distinctive episode, isn't it? I mean,
yes, and it's a moment.
Yes, in time.
Really? Yes. And there are a number of things, if I may just set the scene, having written this book some time ago. It's become very fresh to you, John, since you've never read it.
Yeah, exactly. It's a marvellous book, Clive. I so enjoyed
it. Reviewed with the impartiality one would hope. Well, there are a number of things happening, really, from the 1870s onwards. But one of them was this problem for country houses, which we've mentioned before, which was that there was an agricultural depression which lasted for a very, very long time. It set in, it was because of all the produce that could come from other parts of the world. And it meant that rents from the landed estates, which had previously kept aristocrats going, became much diminished.
And they collapsed, basically. I mean, there's a
I think that's right. And there was no money being spent on the restoration of these cottages and things. And you see by the 1920s, because it went on and on, sort of through, I mean, there was a slight blip in the First World War when we were all scrabbling around trying to produce more food. But there were no horses to produce the food and no men either, so it was very difficult. But it really lasted until the Second World War, when, with the U-boats and so on, which were destroying British shipping, Britain woke up to the fact it had to try to feed itself, and it had a big drive on that. But previously, we could rely on produce coming from overseas. I mean, not least the Empire, of course, which we had at that point. So there was a sort of problem of cash for quite a lot of the aristocracy. But this coincided with the fact that it was made worse, really, by the fact that they were relatively even poorer because there are all these new people who are coming in. I mean, maybe life has always been like this, but it reminds me very much of the present day when suddenly, not so long ago, we used to be talking about people being rich when they had a number of million. Now it's in billions. This figure that nobody knows how many noughts to put on the end of. I mean, so, there was a real step change. There were people coming in from South Africa with gold and diamond mines and so on. There were people who were, financiers like Ernest Cassel, who was a friend of the king. There were people who had done well from an early kind of globalization, like Lord Cowdrey, who had great oil fields in Mexico, and in fact, his coat of arms, he converted a family engineering firm into this worldwide phenomenon, doing enormous projects like building docks and things. And so his coat of arms, the supporters, the figures to either side of his coat of arms, which would usually be a lion and a unicorn or something. Yeah. One was a deep-sea diver in this diving suit, and the other was a Mexican peasant, because he'd got all this oil from Mexico. So, these were huge, huge fortunes. And so the traditional aristocracy was feeling even more hard up than it would have been.
And with the selflessness that it so commonly demonstrates. It decided it would enrich itself by marrying into this.
Yes, with the entrepreneurial spirit. It looked around for opportunities and saw there was one in America.
And that marriage was easier than hard work.
Well, I know, you've got to pity these people because, of course, they hadn't been brought up to do anything other than be in the army. You know, they hadn't really had any other kind of education. I mean, they'd been to Eton and so on, so they could talk very well about things, but they hadn't been brought up to do anything. Apart from the things that aristocrats traditionally did.
Yes, be people, be a big grandees.
Yes.
Grandees.
Yeah. But in the 1870s, there was a new phenomenon, which was that in the United States, after the Civil War, as the United States expanded, there were new fortunes being made on an epic scale in the United States. And this did not go unnoticed. And it's interesting that the agricultural depression set in the 1870s, and that's just when people started to look for brides on the other side of the Atlantic. These two phenomena coincide.
And in fairness, I mean, the idea of finding rich brides is nothing new. I mean, do you know what I mean? It's been going on forever, so it's a perfectly natural extension.
Oh, yes, that's true. It's just that these were coming from a different country.
But I mean, it's exactly...
Which is unusual. But no, that's perfectly true. This was certainly a pattern. And it was very much a familiar pattern in British life. I think it was a rather less familiar pattern in American life. Of course, there was a kind of a trade because Britain, although some of these aristocrats were on their uppers, nevertheless they had a lot of kudos because Britain was still regarded as being
the superpower,
being the superpower. That's true. It was being challenged, but it was, and it had a lot of cultural. Credit, you know. I mean, it
was the old world, and
the old world, and you know, these families had been, say, living in their country houses, or they'd been. There was a recognition that kind of domestic life or social life had evolved. I think, particularly in Britain. I mean, it was also true in other countries, but I think Britain had a settled history in a way that continental countries hadn't. And this had meant that social protocols and rituals had evolved. It was very sophisticated. So the marriages weren't only with British aristocrats, they were also with Italian counts and France. You know, the Comtesse de Polignac, Princess de Polignac, she was a singer of the sewing machine
dynasty. And it's also the case, isn't it? I mean, that in America itself, many of these families had themselves escaped from Europe, or left Europe in the 19th century, and they look back to this as their roots. I mean,
yes, that's true. That's true. Some from Britain. That's perfectly true, and certainly with the men that we'll be talking about in the second part.
That's a very
people like Andrew Carnegie. I mean, I'm not quite sure whether they really sort of re-domiciled himself in Scotland, but he wanted to have a Scottish presence and built himself a sort of great castle.
And there is also another whole dimension to this, isn't there? That it's a period where it's suddenly becoming much safer and easier to cross the Atlantic. I mean, that's
very true.
And that's something that's moved from the steam packet to the, of the early and mid 19th century.
Yes, when Dickens first crossed the Atlantic in 1842, because of course he went to America several times to, particularly to read his books, which is very theatrical, and so he made a lot of money from filling halls where he read his books. When he went in 1842, it was very perilous. It was a paddle steamer, and it was terrible. And very cramped and everything. But by the, not really the 1870s, I think a bit later. Anyway, transport was improving, and it was no longer so dangerous, unless you say the Titanic, obviously.
You didn't anticipate that.
With these four very rich people, I mean, there were all kinds of people on these ships, but for the
very rich. It was extraordinarily
rich, and they were like floating palaces. Then they were also decorated by first-class architects, and every care was taken to make these absolute symbols of luxury. And so it was no painful thing if you had the money to cross the Atlantic.
No, so I mean, there are easier links. There's the rise of the plutocracy in America. There's the agricultural decline in Britain, and the aristocracy looking out for good brides, as they always have, suddenly see this new supply.
Yes.
And when does this really begin as a phenomenon? I mean, there are, of course,
strangely, it coincides with the appearance of this agricultural depression. I mean, that
So from the 1870s?
From the 1870s. I mean, that must be a coincidence, because I don't suppose people realise that the depression, because farming obviously goes up and down over the years, but I don't suppose people realise it was going to become this very deep-seated depression, which didn't go away for such a long time. But the two phenomena do coincide strangely. And the very first ones were sort of, in the quite early 1870s, one of the very first ones was the marriage between Lord Randolph Churchill, a son of the Duke of Marlborough, the father of Sir Winston Churchill, and Jenny Jerome. And she was the daughter of a speculator, and they met, I think, on the Isle of Wight. I think it was sort of Cowes Festival or something like that, or Cowes Regatta. And within 3 days, they got engaged. I think that was a very unfortunate marriage. A lot of these, I'm afraid, were. But it was unfortunate because Lord Randolph Churchill went mad. Or did he have syphilis?
Possibly both. I
think one might have led to the other. That was not
an example.
It was not going to have a happy ending. But and also there's another one that also wasn't very happy. Consuelo Isnaga married the dreadful Duke of Manchester. She wasn't particularly rich, actually, but then he was epically a libertine and a dreadful man.
It is interesting, is that
perhaps she was rich. She came from Cuba. I think her fortune came from Cuba, and he must have been attracted by her money, apart from the fact that she was beautiful. Anyway. I
mean, the point is also that these it's a phenomenon of this period that engagements are often very, very short, aren't they? And you get the sense of these people, certainly the women coming over for the London season, don't you? And they arrive in London and...
yes, that's true.
And after all, there's the so-called fishing fleet going out to India of good British wives for British servants in India.
I see what you mean. Those girls in the same way.
The girls in the same way, going out and often under the care of aged aunts and things.
Yes.
and trying to find husbands for themselves. So it's not as though it's entirely a one-way street.
No, John. I wanted to read two things since this will come as a complete surprise to you.
Clive reaches for his book.
I know. I can't. There are two things. One from the male point of view, one from the girl's point of view, which I think kind of illustrate what was going on. And one, I was very pleased to find this. This is the 27-year-old Sir Thomas George Fermor-Hesketh, who became...
Eastern Neston.
Yes, from Eastern Neston. They also had, I think, Rufford Oldhall.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
So they had a number of houses. But no money by this stage. And so he set off when he was... he inherited from his brother, who died, I think, I read here, in the Zulu Wars.
You remind yourself.
And the first thing he did was to take his yacht and go off on a round-the-world cruise. And they went to places like Japan, and he became rather dashing. He rescued somebody from drowning, I think. But they sailed into San Francisco Harbor, and they were sort of, on the last leg of their cruise. And they wanted to sort of bag another kind of game from the...
After having massacred wildlife around the world.
Yes, exactly. And so this is a quotation from a diary kept by one of the people on the boat. Nothing could exceed the kindness and hospitality of everyone we met. Head gave us a dinner party, had some very pretty girls to meet us. We spent a most enjoyable evening, never left the house till 2:30. I met a Miss Croker, a very nice girl with heaps of the needful, meaning money. Francis got hooked on and has landed her, I think. Hesketh, Sir Thomas, Hesketh has two on hand, both very nice, can't make up his mind. I must say American girls are very pretty, dress well, have good feet, lots of fun, and very sharp. Some have lots of money. So those are some young men on the lookout, going to, see what the prospects were.
And this theme...
And he marries one. I mean, Sir Thomas marries one from San Francisco.
And the theme of the Americans being independent, amusing, engaging in a way that their English or British counterparts are not, is a theme.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one that, of course,
Very much so.
P.G. Wodehouse in his books absolutely picks up on, isn't it? These incredibly capable, determined, able American girls, and then very often contrasting with slightly... Well, no, not in the P.G. Wodehouse novels, because there are... But do you get the sense of the men thinking that British girls are just rather dull and staid and they have no fun?
No. Well, that's true. There was a phenomenon called of the American girl, and that's what people called it. And it was much written about, referred to by Henry James, no less, for instance, and tons of other people. And I suppose it was the age of the Gibson girl.
What's the Gibson? Sorry, I say
the Gibson girl. Well, it was a creation of a type. Forgotten the person who drew her, but she illustrated it very sporty, and with a sort of slightly boyish look, but very capable. But the thing about the American girls is they were much better educated for a start. They were, their parents took the trouble to educate them. This was not the case with these cash-strapped aristos in Britain, because there was no point, because they'd marry well, and that was it. That was their lives. Their life had been solved through marriage. But in America, there was there was a completely different outlook, and also they seemed to be given much more freedom. English girls were cosseted, I think, because perhaps in relation to their marriage prospects, they didn't. Scandal would have been a very bad thing.
They're sort of chaperoned more strictly, aren't they?
That seems to be the case, and so American girls were very lively, often like the Gibson girl, the prototype, as it were. They were sporty, but equally they were able to hold a conversation. And they had views about things. I mean, this was absolutely exceptional. They could talk to men of any age on not exactly equal terms, because if your father-in-law was in the Houses of Parliament, he probably had a bit more gossip. But they held political views. I mean, this was, or at least opinions that they could articulate. Whereas English girls just sort of simpered and giggled and
and by the same
talked
token,
about ponies.
and by the same token, many of them also were very conscious that they were desirable catches, weren't they?
Yes.
I mean, it's not as though they were all sort of naively, turning up and being, attracting all these men. They were conscious too that the people were pursuing them.
Yes.
I think.
Well, John, this is such a good segue into the second reading. I'm going to.
What an interesting book that is, Clive.
Who
wrote it?
It's called An Exuberant Catalogue of Dreams. You'll be surprised to know it's out of print, but still. So here is the wonderful May Golette, who really, frankly, anybody would fall in love with, but because she's very slim and
marries the Duke of Roxburgh.
Yes, but just sort of slightly unexpectedly for reasons I'll say. But she has this correspondence with her aunt, who is Grace Vanderbilt, and she describes what it's like to be launched
in the social circuit.
Yes, exactly. So she says to her aunt, who is, she is in Bad Homburg, so she's, they're staying in different places around Europe. This is very cosmopolitan and European. It's so like the world of Henry James or Edith Wharton, for example, the novelist who was a great friend of his and actually detailed social life for this tranche of American society so well. But anyway, she writes from Bad Homburg.
Which is in Switzerland, is it? I don't know. It doesn't matter.
It's Germany, I think.
Germany.
Oh, yes. She says... she's 22 years old. It was simply glorious. You know how fond I am of dancing, and all my old partners were so kind to me, and I made several new ones, because she's pretending, it's so extraordinary. Everybody wanted to dance, and I can't imagine why. I must give an account of my proposals. Well, first Lord Shaftesbury popped the question. Popped almost as soon as he returned to London. He came one afternoon. Mamma happened to leave the room for a few minutes, and off he went like a pistol. I told him it was quite ridiculous, as he'd only known me 3 weeks, and he couldn't possibly know his own mind. And besides, I knew nothing of him. nor his past, beyond the fact that when he was 21, he had been devoted to Lady N. I don't know who Lady N is, which he said was true. But that was all over long ago. And he was certain he knew his own mind. I like him very much, only I have no intention of marrying him or anyone else at present. And so, all these young men were kind of... And she goes on to describe how, men were endlessly...
Proposing at
the drop of a hat, because, why not? They just tried their luck.
It really is like a P.G. Wodehouse.
It is. And she chose, to everyone's astonishment, she chose the Duke of Roxburgh, who... lived up in the borders of Scotland, somewhere called Fleurs, which perhaps we should spell.
Yes, it's spelt floors, but it's
spelt like
Fleurs.
Anyway, there they were. There he was at Fleurs, and he was not regarded as the sharpest knife in the box, but she took to him. His nickname was Bumble, which might suggest.
And he was a cavalry officer, wasn't he?
Cavalry officer.
And do you remember
He liked polo, she liked shopping.
You and I, a long time ago, we had an absolutely wonderful afternoon when we went up and we went through the correspondence. After lunch, we went through the correspondence between them in the archive there. And she is gallivanting around Europe and going to antique shops in Paris
shopping,
and buying
smart
things.
Shopping.
And he is in the army playing chukkers of polo. And the postcards between them, I seem to remember, you get a letter from her saying, my darling, we went to Monsieur Bertrand's yesterday. I bought 3 tapestries and various chairs, and Mamma said this, and this happened, and that happened, and the Duc d'Orléans or something did this and that. And then you get a card back from him saying, played 3 chukkers of polo, scored twice, love you more than I can say, Bumble. And just the sort of the asymmetry of the correspondence.
Not sex at all. But obviously they're very fond of each other, and it lasted.
Well, I was about to say, it shone through the correspondence that someone who could only describe his chukkers and then signed his letters, loving you more than I can say. It really did speak of very deep affection, and it was very touching, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
And the house entirely reflects... The main rooms reflect her...
Yes, totally, all her shopping.
Shopping, both luxurious bathrooms and
they're very important. Yes, absolutely.
One magnificent bathroom, and then
of course, that's what all this American money did. This as it came. I was going to say flushing in, but that's probably the wrong word.
The bidet of American money.
But these houses were often pretty antiquated, and so electric light was important, and certainly decent plumbing, which was always a problem, partly because it gave people things like typhoid. So, these houses were modernised by American money, and often in a particular taste. And Fleurs is rather a good example, because it was this very smart French taste. And, absolutely lovely.
And tapestried amongst
tapestries. I mean, it was super luxurious. It was a bit like the Frick Museum or anywhere like that. I mean, this was an international taste associated particularly with the Rothschild family, but spread further than that. But out went all the old Scottish furniture.
Yes,
which is now regretted by some furniture historians.
Yes, but you find it's hard to imagine Fleurs as having much comfortable furniture. I mean, some bit survives, doesn't it? There, but it's
But I think
peculiar.
there was a change. It's what happens in any generation. But there was a change of the guard. The house was modernised, but the collection which had been there for a long time before was sort of relegated to housekeepers' rooms or whatever, or maybe burnt. I don't know.
And the sadness is that there are some happy marriages, but I mean, a lot of them are notoriously unsuccessful, aren't they?
Well, of course, the famous one is obviously at Blenheim.
Yeah.
Consuelo Vanderbilt marries the 9th Duke of Marlborough.
Whose nickname is Sonny, isn't it?
Yes.
Rather inappropriately.
But actually comes from his courtesy title of Sunderland, I think.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I think it's nothing to do with his personality. But the
it certainly wasn't, was it? No. Sonny by name, but not by nature. No.
Blenheim is an example. East and Leicester was the same, that there were generations of American marriages. Sonny's father, the 8th Duke, had married Lillian Hammersley. Lillian, which people unkindly rhymed with million, and so she called herself Lily. But that also, I think it was the Hammersley money that led to the installation of that great big organ. Do you remember we were talking about organs?
Oh, in the long...
how sort of plutocratic they were in that very long room. But anyway, Sonny married Consuelo Vanderbilt. It didn't go well, and then he married another American himself, who actually not rich but very, very beautiful at that time. But then, unfortunately, she had some early cosmetic surgery done to make herself even more beautiful and became a gargoyle. What was her name, John?
Do you know,
Grace. I can't remember.
I'd forgotten.
It's gone out of my mind. But
do you get a sense? I mean, with these marriages, I suppose particularly ones that go wrong, that there must have been a sense of isolation, that they begin to feel that they are only being valued for their money. And I'm sure there were more than enough British people in society who were disdainful of the money.
Absolutely.
And it must have been a really horribly isolating. If it went wrong,
yes,
you suddenly found yourself.
And to be honest, that it generally did. I cannot say that. I mean, it's lovely that May Galette was happy, and she made a wonderful duchess, and everybody thought she
was wonderful.
But I can't really say that was typical of this phenomenon, and it's such a shame.
But is that also because it was such a transactional thing, or is it because, in fact, like Henry VIII, people initially like women who say no and have opinions, and then they discover that they didn't have opinions? I mean, was it a mixture of things?
I think it's a mixture. It's very well analysed in Consuelo Vanderbilt's book, The Glitter and the Gold, which is all about this.
Because she writes a sort of vindication of herself.
She writes. I mean, it's slightly complicated because one has to say, Sonny's papers have never been released, so they're locked up somewhere in Blenheim, and there could be another side to the story, but we don't know what it was. And two, both of them had reasons to present the marriage in the light that she did, which was that she didn't really have any power over the marriage because she was bullied into it by her mother. I think that if you...
Of course, it's her mother, isn't her?
And she was incredibly young. I mean, she just... Of course, this is true of all these girls. I mean... May was over 20. I mean, she was 22 when she was writing the letters that I quoted. But Consuelo Vanderbilt was 18 when she married. And she was bullied into it by her mother, according to The Glitter and the Gold. But that doesn't seem to be the case if you read the social accounts of life in Newport or something. She was sailing around with Sonny, but whilst he was still whatever it was, Sunderland, not appearing to look very unhappy about it before the marriage. But you see, he had become Roman Catholic. And she eventually married Jacques Balsan, who was French and possibly also Catholic. So they had a reason. They had to get the marriage annulled. I don't think it was a divorce. So there was a motive for writing the book in that way. So I just run that up the flagpole as a slight caveat in reading this book. But what is absolutely startling and to us rather horrific about the book is how this young girl, I mean, parallel possibly with Princess Diana, that she comes very young into this world, which is entirely kind of self-made, not entirely self-made, but entirely made. All the rituals and everything. Everybody knows what to do. Everybody knows everybody else. The whole thing's been set up and working like that for decades and decades and decades. And she is the only one who doesn't know. And she's got to find her
place within it.
Place and run it. And, she is... It's like suddenly becoming, running Blenheim would have been like being the chief executive of a sort of medium-sized company. Yeah. And so she also has to contend.
Rather more fun.
No, not for her. Because she had to contend with all, apart from anything else.
The household. And
all the household and all Sonny's relations. I mean, she had to absolutely, I think it's in The Glitter of the Gold, at the end of a dinner, the hostess would get up and lead all the ladies out of the room, and they'd all go up to the drawing room, and the men would sit around drinking port or something. And this was a critical moment, and she didn't get up first. I think something like Sonny's aunt did, or something, or maybe Sonny's mother. And I think she'd been briefed about this, and she said, "Oh, are you leaving the table? I'm so sorry. Are you ill?"
Yes.
Which, of course, in fact, saved the day for her and established her position. I mean, sometimes people try to leave the door at the same time, got sort of stuck in the middle. But to do this when you're 18 with no previous experience
it's a very big demand, and you haven't been trained to it, and the sense of having faux pas all the time, and as I said,
you're embattled.
And this you can.
And everyone else knew what the form was, and you had to learn it. And it didn't change. It didn't. There was no flexibility. I mean, all these people had such primitive ideas about, well, one, their own complacence, and two, no knowledge whatsoever of what happened anywhere else. Do you have fish in America?
Yes.
Was one comment.
Yes.
And this sort of thing. Because they were so sure that the way they did things, they were the top of the
tree.
Absolute top of the tree, and didn't really care about what happened anywhere else. And were in fact completely ignorant. But they were not aware that they were being ignorant. They just thought they were it.
The supreme form of stupidity.
Yes. And there were two things that were, there was the attitude of Sonny to somebody who came from America was inconceivable, because he famously expressed his role at Blenheim to be the link in the chain, the link which connected his father to his son. And as long as you didn't drop it whilst you were actually Duke, you were able to pass on the whole shebang to the next generation. You served your purpose. That was your purpose in life. I mean, it wasn't, Consuelo Vanderbilt came from a world in which people were making these huge fortunes themselves. So they, had a pretty different attitude to, and also the sheer feudalism which prevailed at Blenheim. At the end of every meal, there were all these things left over, and she instituted a change. Because they had these, I think they were called cans, these great big kind of metal tin kind of canisters, which food was put in to share with the poor of the estate. And her change was to ensure that the different courses of the meal were separated. Because before, the food was just sort of, it was like pig's swill, it was
you just chucked it all.
The sort of peach melba or something was put in with the roast beef. And it was just shoveled in like one great big slop. And then it was given to the poor. So, the cultural gulf
was very deep.
And of course, just one. This is my last thing. Are we going about to break?
No, we're about to break, but you have one more anecdote.
Well, just one more thing about,
That's very funny, Clive.
You'll probably find it in this book. But, so I think this is true, not just a blend, but anyway, but, these houses were very poorly provided for by American standards, because, of course, in America, the houses of the very rich had been quite recently built. This was not the case with the houses of the aristocracy in Britain. And so these, the ladies who formed the house parties had to change many times during the day. But actually getting a bath
was very complicated.
Was very difficult, because there were very few bathrooms. And so they either had to queue for the bathroom themselves, or they left their ladies' maid in position, holding their place in the queue. And so you'd see this string of ladies' maid, or sometimes countesses, waiting to the bathroom. So the contrast between these two worlds was quite extreme.
Well, that's completely fascinating, Clive. And so we'll take a break now, and then when we return, we will be talking about the men and their experience of this in Britain. Very good.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. So, Clive, welcome back. We've now changed your chair, so hopefully the creaking that may or may not have been noticed by some viewers.
Everything creaks in this house, including me.
And we were going to turn our attention now in the second half to the men.
Yes.
And who they are and their interests. And you were saying that they're, in many ways, they're more diverse. I mean, they're obviously not all coming here to get married. They have more diverse interests by nature of...
I mean, the American girl was, very much a recognised phenomenon, whereas these men engaged in business, there are different types. For example, there were financiers like Walter Burns, and his house survives. It was two houses originally. It survives as the Savile Club, so we can see what it was like. And it was sort of pretty cutting edge in terms of taste, because he didn't really like London. He liked Paris. He was a cosmopolitan figure. He spoke fluent French and so on. And he's
basically acting as a banker for the
Pierpont Morgans.
In London, but
yes.
He has widely...
He was their man of business, because he had married one of the daughters. So he was in their...
he was the London office.
He was the London office, exactly. But the taste in which he did his house was French, and he brought over an architect from Paris to do it. But eventually, London caught up with all this, and it got onto this taste, this sort of Louis XVI style, and but Burns was ahead of the game in that.
And we were thinking, in fact, of doing an episode precisely on this sort of French taste, plutocratic French taste in London. I mean, it is worth saying one thing. I mean, in a very practical sense, about how Americans were coming to Britain in this period. I mean, it's a very obvious point to make, but. Whereas today we get teleported generally into the surrounds of London if you fly in. In the
not necessarily the best part.
Not best exactly, but in the 19th century, you're going variously. First of all, to Liverpool, sometimes to Bristol, and then latterly to Southampton, aren't you? Which is the ports cities, and it gives I think it's important to say, it would have given a completely different impression of Britain, because you're having to travel through countryside, aren't you, to get towards London. I mean, you're heading for London, but you can get caught on the way, and you get a sense of all these different people. I mean, from Henry James. Upwards, that they're interested by other places in Britain, not just the capital city.
No, that's true. It's true in the Cotswolds, for example, because the Cotswolds in their present incarnation were sort of invented, really, by this group of American artists and writers, I mean, Henry James and Sargent and illustrators for American magazines, who went to Broadway, and it's what they did in the summer. And so that was, very often... a place will be discovered by artists, and then everybody else piles in because they see this as a good thing, that these rather imaginative people have spotted something that nobody else knew about. And so that was they were a different kind of working American in Britain, if you like. There was a wonderful artist called Abbey who painted these enormous murals. I think, was it the Boston Public Library, one of the public libraries? And there's there's terribly interesting descriptions of how he had to stage that was the most important thing. Yes, it was the dress. It was the details of the dress, which his wife made. It wasn't really the painting. He could get other people to do the painting, but it was the intellectual conception, staging everybody. He went mad in the end.
And I mean, Henry James is part of that
sort
of artistic set, and there's this very overt fascination, isn't it? I mean, just Anglophilia, isn't it? That they just love the countryside, its appearance.
I mean, of course, it was European in the case of Henry James.
Yes,
and he had it. Obviously, he went back. He became a British subject in the end, but he did, of course, travel in lots of other places, with this famous discrimination.
But then, so that's the sort of artistic set, and there are a few. I mean, there are one or two plutocrats in their own right. I mean, you think of William Waldorf Astor.
Well, and they overlap with him, really, because he he got very, very fed up with America, because at the turn of in the late 19th century, the press was very aggressive. Yeah. And it was very down. Of course, it was the age when, robber barons were emerging, of which he might have been one. These very rich people who were not universally applauded in the Republic of America. So they got a very bad press. And William Waldorf Astor disliked that very much. He went to be minister in Rome, American minister in Rome. Eventually, he settled in Britain, but in Rome he had collected a lot of things. He was a collector. He was also a sort of literary gent, a bit, or that's how he saw himself. And his writing is absolutely terrible. He had to buy a magazine, the Pall Mall magazine, to ensure that it was published. If you owned the magazine, you could get your things published. But it's worth reading because it shows the imagination, but it's probably quite typical of people of his age. I mean, it's rather more highly coloured in Astor's case, and he went to the trouble to write stories. But it was sort of sub-Walter Scott. Walter Scott was writing these romances, in his case, about Scotland, and imagining Ivanhoe, imagining people in the Middle Ages, essentially, as though they were Victorian, and interpreting them with Victorian motives, what they did. But Astor was the same somewhat, and he collected, but he particularly collected things which had stories attached to them, or if they didn't have stories, he made one up. It was a sort of old chest with a bit of broken sword sticking out of it. I mean, that was the sort of thing, and he imagined
that it was from, yes, it was...
that what had happened to it. I mean, he didn't exactly know, but...
That Blackbeard's chest had been rescued from the Caribbean.
Yes, all that. Exactly. And of course, anything to do with Anne Boleyn or whatever, these famous figures from the past, or even if they were just not famous, or just the furniture survived. But he came over, I think in 1893, and he bought a house called Cliveden, which is overlooking the Thames, and it's not very far from London, and it's always been a great show house. People, great grandees had it for entertaining and stuff. Poor old William Wald of Astor, his beloved wife, Mamie, died the next year, and I don't know whether it was always like this, but he became quite grumpy and reclusive, and so actually it wasn't his friend, or the entertaining that happened was very odd, because he wasn't a very conventional kind of host.
Yes,
and so that was strange. But he
does fall out with society on both sides of the Atlantic, doesn't he?
Yes, he does. He was obviously somebody who fell out with everybody. But he had his collection, and some of it is in the garden. And there's because people could buy up bits of Italy or bits of anywhere, and so he's got I think it's a great balustrade from the Villa Borghese, and he's got these Roman sarcophagi, high quality. They're just sitting there in the garden as part of, and then, statue, great lawn and a vista and a statue standing at the end of it. So he could display his collection there, and he inside the house, something that survives from his time is the staircase. And this is a house, I think, was it designed by Barry? Or
this is from 1840s.
Exactly. Wonderful, plutocratic of that period. Can't remember the Duke. Anyway, it's very ducal and splendid, but classical. Yeah. Italianate classical. But he rebuilds the staircase in a kind of... it's got all these statues on it, carved statues of sort of figures of medieval romance. And it's all dark wood. So it couldn't really be more inappropriate to that setting.
And he does.
But it suggests these figures. I can't remember who they all were, but figures from the Middle Ages, figures from.
Well, he does the same, of course, at Temple Place, doesn't he, in London, where the staircase has all the three musketeers. I mean, they're literary figures.
Literary reference, yes, exactly.
Running up the stairs. And again, it's quite difficult to characterise stylistically what they are. They're sort of partly Jacobean and partly classical. I mean, it's a very odd mixture.
Yes.
But again, it's the ascent, isn't it? An amazing floor inlaid in Temple Place.
Yes.
Inlaid floor, and then you rise up the staircase and it sort of carries you to the main room. I mean,
wonderful jewel box. Very, very striking. But by the time he did that, he had slightly moved on, because his son, Waldorf, married, and this actually shows the impact that some Americans had in Britain, because his son married Nancy Langhorne, who became actually famous as Nancy Astor.
The first MP, isn't she? First
woman MP. The first woman MP to take a seat. There had actually been a sort of one from Ireland who was elected but refused to sit now. So that's rather technicality. Anyway, she was known as this very striking thing, the first functioning female MP. And she was very outspoken and lively, and she came from Virginia, so she was brook no nonsense, and great on horses and so on. And her niece was Nancy Lancaster, the decorator, who really created the country house style, if you like, in decoration, which prevailed really for decades as being the sort of what everybody thought a country house was. And it was created by this lovely American from Virginia who was thinking of, the sort of, it was a style which was sort of particularly appropriate after the Second World War, because everything was run down. And she was thinking of the childhood homes in Virginia, which also had this faded charm.
And very outdoorsy as well.
Very, very outdoorsy. She we're slightly running ahead of ourselves, but she married, her first husband was called Ronnie Tree, who was again an American, and he wanted to be in Parliament. And so the thing that you did in those days, you became the master of a fox hunt.
You bought a hunting box.
You bought a hunting box, and you became if you were, because to be a master, MFH, Master of Foxhounds, that was a real position in society. It sounds extraordinary now.
And you could shout at other people.
Oh, yes, you could shout at other people, whoever they were. That's absolutely true. And they couldn't say anything, or they wouldn't be invited again.
But, I mean, Astor is really interesting because he does create this group of buildings, doesn't he? Temple Place, he rebuilds Hever.
Yes, and he moves to Hever. He gives
Kent.
Cliveden to his son Waldorf and Nancy as their wedding present. They'd been very worried because Nancy had had a very unfortunate first marriage and got out of it after a very short time. It was all very abusive. But they were very worried that William Waldorf Astor would not welcome her. But he did, and he gave her some, I don't know, jewels that belonged to Marie Antoinette or something as a wedding present. And they also Cliveden. Yeah. And so he moved to Hever, which is in Kent on the other side of London, again not very far out, but this little castle which had, very important for him, associations with Anne Boleyn.
It's the Boleyn castle, and it's the Boleyn family castle and moated. But I mean, it's extraordinary because it is actually very small, and I think, you know, up until that point, it's been celebrated. I mean, since the early 19th century, this British obsession with the Tudors. You know,
yes.
Accounts of, you know, visitors trying to get into the castle, and there being big signs saying we don't want any visitors. But I mean, he takes this building over, and it's far too small, and he basically totally reinvents it in a way that, of course, actually slightly annoys some antiquarians because they want to go through the gate and find Tudor.
Not people who've written a book called The English Castle,
no,
such as you.
Well, I think he's made it an infinitely more interesting building, and I would also say I mean, he turns it effectively into a village. I mean, he sort of creates a village structure behind the castle, spreading out and what I think when I first saw that, and also first saw Temple Place, the thing that really impressed me about it was the quality of all the furnishings and fittings. I mean, you know, he's not somebody who's thoughtlessly throwing money after effect. Everything is absolutely beautifully crafted. And in Temple Place, when you go up that staircase, I seem to remember that the door into the main long gallery, it has gilded bronze panels inlaid in the door. And then when you walk into the gallery itself, you know, to either end there are Clayton and Bell windows of dawn and dusk. And I mean, it's a really, beautifully...
Done beautifully.
Finished. I mean, it doesn't really make it's not always very coherent, but everything individually is of superlative quality.
Yes, and he chose a very good architect who was Frank Loughborough Pearson.
Pearson, indeed,
so he was choosing very well. But a couple of things I'd say about Hever. One is that his village, because he kept the castle, this little castle, which was sort of intact, and that's where he stayed. But then on the other side of the moat, he built this village that John was just talking about. And that was quite a clever thing to do, really, because he didn't just, take the castle and build on several extra wings so that he could put his guests there. He didn't actually want his guests in the castle. He was paranoid, and he pulled up the drawbridge every night for reasons of security, and he had detectives patrolling the grounds. So he didn't want anybody else. He had this very odd attitude towards entertainment, but in a way that's rather successful. But the other thing which is striking is that there is this extraordinary garden, and that's not Tudor at all. Yes, he has this long walk, which is really marvellous, but it's so typical of the taste of that time. It's all garden in with marvellous roses and peonies and everything sort of growing in a sort of abundant way. And amongst that are the statues that he's been collecting in Italy. So all these ancient statues in this garden setting, and you go down, and then you get to the end where there's a balustrade, and beyond that there's a lake, it looks like Lake Como or something. Of course, it's not quite as big as Lake Como, but it had to be dug, and he had 900 people with shovels digging the lake. Can you imagine 900 people? And think of the disparity of income. He could afford to have 900 navvies digging away.
It is interesting. I mean, it's an Italianate garden, but in a form that could only be in Britain, isn't it? It's very green, but it has this architectural frame. But it's a sort of.
But it's very, very evocative. It's evocative of Astor's were, I mean, he wanted it to be evocative of, I don't know, the Appian Way or something, but it's actually very evocative of Astor's world.
I seem to remember this
the aesthetic values
of it. I may be partly misremembering the details of this story, but I seem to remember that because of the way the castle sits and because of all the new things, the plumbing he installs, there's some problem with getting all the waste, should we call it, from the castle out to wherever it's meant to go, and that he installed this absolutely state-of-the-art machine that automatically pumped everything uphill. And it was
that would
done...
be very typical.
Very typical. But it was all done so beautifully and it all kind of worked in some ways that everybody completely forgot that this is how everything was being expelled from the castle. And then about, 10 years or 15 years ago, the castle, I should say, is beautifully maintained.
Yes.
But this suddenly broke. Everybody realised that, in fact, for the last 100 years or so, the technology just been working away, and they actually had to do something about it. But again, emphasising that the engineering too is of a very high quality.
Yes.
They're very fun. Going back, sorry, we're going.
Oh well, I was going to raise just a different theme because I know that we're getting to the end of our allotted time.
Yeah.
But what we have to say is something about after the First World War. But I'll save that until. You've said you were about to say something.
Yes. No, well, I was going to say that there are some very funny early photographs in Country Life of Temple Place.
Yes.
Which shows...
That was the estate office.
Which is the estate office in London.
Although that's actually also where he lived, and he, again, had some incredibly elaborate thing. You could lock all the doors in the house from his bedroom because he was so anxious.
Because I didn't know that. I'd forgotten if I ever did. I mean, the photographs that Country Life takes show some of the rooms filled with bric-a-brac and kind of slightly strange museum displays, including, I seem to remember, a mannequin dressed like a figure from a painting, a Dutch painting of the 17th century, holding a mandolin. I mean, it looks incredibly wooden and strange, but
again, these stories.
And
that was evoking a story.
It is the sense of stories that's so important. Isn't it? It's a very, it's a curious thing. Just before we finish, because I think we have a few extra minutes. I
haven't said about after the First World War yet.
Exactly. I want to hear about that. But are there any other major figures like Astor?
Yes, there's Andrew Carnegie, for example. He returns. There are a number of people who had gone to America. Andrew Carnegie left as a child. His father was a hand loom weaver and was put out of business by the Industrial Revolution, and so they moved, very, very poor, to America, and he made this colossal fortune from steel. And I think he was a business partner. He was certainly a steel man called, I think it was called Alexander Forbes Leith. He again was Scottish and bought a house called a castle called Fyvie. So there were these people who had gone and they wanted to come back and assert either to live permanently in the land of their fathers or to assert their connection. And Andrew Carnegie's castle is, of course, absolutely stonkingly enormous.
It's Skibo.
Yes, not a thing of obvious beauty.
And he is doing all the libraries as well.
Yes. Oh, yes, of course, on both sides of the Atlantic. And the library in beloved Ramsgate
is also by Carnegie.
Yes, and it's a beautiful little building of 1913.
It is also, it's a point you've already made, but it is a very important one, isn't it? That obviously we're talking about this through a prism of Britain, but in fact American interest is very international, isn't it? It's in Europe as the old world as a whole, isn't it?
Yes,
and there are some people who focus their attention in Britain, but there are, as is being collected in the States, these great collections like Pierpont Morgan. In fact, they're just putting their tentacles into absolutely everything that they can buy from Europe.
They're forming a new ensemble, aren't they? But out of all these different kind of cultural artifacts, but they're creating something which is new and distinctive, but using old things.
And so, William Randolph Hearst and other, but we're going to come to that. Come on, that's after the war.
Yes,
so after the First World War.
I won't dwell on this, John. You'll be pleased to know. But it might be revisited because actually it's an interesting subject. But before the First World War, these girls and their mothers had been interested in the British aristocracy. Strangely, the sort of supply of heiresses seems to have run out around about 1912, and there don't seem to have been so many marriages of that type. But I think it was so many more marriages, but I think it was partly that the First World War was such a catastrophe for Europe. I noticed talking to American friends, they don't quite visualised in that way. They had the Civil War, which caused such bloodshed. But for them, life was continuing. It was a war, but it wasn't so impactful for them as it was here. But of course, the whole of Europe was sort of ruined, and not quite so much as it would do by the Second World War. But the Second World War was in a way a continuation of the First. But everybody, no maintenance was done of these great big houses, for example, that aristocrats were living in, and suddenly the balance tilted, and it's sort of noticeable. I don't know whether, this might be sort of more symbolic than anything, but for example, when the Prince of Wales, the future Edward VIII, went to the United States in about 1919, he loved it, and one of the things he loved were all the houses on Long Island, because they were like the houses that he knew at home, i.e. they were very big and they had cultural references to Europe and whatnot, but they were all new and they were all efficient and they had all this plumbing, and it was fantastic. And you didn't have to have any of this feudal nonsense, with all these obligations that landowners felt to their tenants and things. They were built for pleasure, they were built for sport, for dancing and all the things that he liked. Cocktails. So, he absolutely loved it. And of course, his downfall as king was when he decided to marry an American. So, it shows how, and he had a whole string of American girlfriends before that. So it shows that he had seen the future in a sense. But also some American hostesses who came from across the Atlantic made a big impact on British social life in a way that would have been absolutely impossible in the Edwardian period. A famous one was Maud Cunard. One of the striking things about them, I think she came from San Francisco, but some of them came here because they slightly burnt their boats in America, or they had a slight cloud. But they could come, nobody knew about that, it was so far away still. And so she came from San Francisco, and she, as a young girl, her mother perhaps didn't give her the best possible upbringing, but anyway, a general of the Civil War called Carpentier, I think he was called, he was a bibliophile, but he also collected young girls, and she was one of them. He liked them like his books, virgin with their leaves uncut. Can you imagine how horrible that was? But anyway, so she had the shadow of this person sort of slightly clung to her, or horrible, creepy. So, but nobody knew about it in Britain, and she married a member of the Cunard family. They owned a country house. She was very arty and she loved Wagner and things. He didn't at all. He was just a hunting squire and found it very inexplicable that all these people were behaving in arty ways in his house. So that didn't really last. But she had a salon in London. It was a time when you still had salons and everybody came. And similarly, there was a more unexpected one called Corrigan. And she again had a rather dubious history from her time in America and was also much less adept than Maud Cunard. And she had these parties to which she invited everybody. And she gave them all, I think it was called a favour. I think they might have been called cotillon presents or something. Or maybe it was a cotillon favour. Anyway, there were things like gold cigarette cases and stuff. And everyone said, she's so vulgar, this person, that nobody will ever go. But of course, everybody went because
took their favours.
Took their favours home. And so
they could live. Basically, they could live an existence. They could leave their past behind.
They could leave their past behind, exactly. But I think the significant thing is that these Americans, the boot was now on the other foot, rather than the Americans looking at the English aristocracy as the pinnacle of the world. There'd been a change and people were very interested by what was happening in America because this was the new...
Yes, this was the future, wasn't it?
This was where things were going and it seemed to work so much better.
And you do see that in almost every sphere, don't you? In architecture too, there's that...
Yes.
I think it's something I didn't appreciate for a long time, just how aware of America in 1930s, English, British architecture is.
Yes. Very much seen in Cambridge at the University Library, which has got this socking great tower. It was built by Giles Scott. But the reason it's got the tower is because it was being funded by Rockefeller. And he said he wanted a tower because there are so many towers. You know, they were part of the landscape of American universities.
And yes, you just have to have it.
Yeah.
There are all sorts of people we haven't talked about, but William Randolph Hearst being a case in point, and St Donuts and everything. But I mean, but there's, you know, it is fascinating. I mean, it's almost an absurd way of summarising and concluding the whole thing. But you can't help feeling that in parody, the novels of P.G. Wodehouse touch on all the themes we've talked about,
yes.
don't they? The idea of British people loving America more than they love their own country. The idea of American girls being much more sort of, you know, driven and engaging.
Yes.
The idea of these absurd plutocrats who that come over and have lots and lots of money and resolve the plots in a happy way, and these utterly unimaginative English peers who go over and get their sons, introduce them to lots of Americans for money.
And they're living. There's one. I can't remember which one it is, but there's one. He's living in a crumbling country house, and of course he's just desperate to get rid of it. He can't imagine anybody mad enough to
take it on.
But an American comes and some J. Stoker Washburn or something, you know,
and eventually
he turns it into a sort of virtually an insane asylum for people, you know, smart people with nervous disorders. But to them, you know, They see this as being full of antiquity and romance, and you know the only thing space is he talks about the tax and all the rest of it. They can't do anything with it, and they just want to get rid of it and get into something which is more convenient, where they can actually have a life.
Yeah, so in a rather wonderful way, it covers this theme, and of course it's a relationship that continues to develop, and you know Anglo-American relations remain close. and they
may they forever.
May they forever, indeed. Excellent.
Thanks, John.
Thanks.